Well, good evening, everybody. It's 7 o'clock sharp, and we have an aggressive program this evening. So I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Renee Settle Robinson, and I'm co-chair of the Wisconsin Health Professionals for Climate Action Anti-Racism Committee. And I say co-chair because I also share that responsibility with Dr. Caitlin Rublee. This evening, we're doing a flash talk series called Prescribing Anti-Racism in Wisconsin Climate Action. So we would like everybody to introduce yourselves in the chat room while other people join us as we proceed. If you can go on to the next slide, Abby. So what is the WCHA all about? The Wisconsin Health Professionals for Climate Action is what the acronym stands for. WCHA is a group of health professionals dedicated to educating about and advocating for equitable climate solutions. Climate solutions are health solutions. And if you look at these beautiful pictures, you saw a lot of the people that are serving on the executive committee, including the one at the top in the middle who is conducting our slides for us tonight. Thank you, Abby. You go on to the next one now. So we just want to provide you with a land acknowledgement. Many of you don't realize just how much of Wisconsin is originally occupied by American Indians or our indigent people. Questions to reflect on: whose land are you occupying? And what is the history of the area I live in? Who's telling that history? And does it acknowledge the genocide, the forced removal, the resistance? What names and borders are commonly used to describe your area? How does that impact your understanding of the land? How has colonization shaped my community? What forms of colonization are still occurring today? What aspects of your identity, for example, privileges, intersections, impact your perspective on place? What Indigenous-led initiatives are happening in your community? And how can you support this work? So if you'll go on to the next slide. Today's topics and speakers are as follows. First of all, we're going to have Elizabeth Ward presenting us with Redlining and Energy Burden in Milwaukee. And then we'll have Jean Bikomeye. I hope I didn't mess up your name, sir. Who is...
That's correct.
Okay, good. I did a good job. Good. Okay, who has an MPH and is a PhD candidate. And he will be presenting on urban green space and health equity. And after that, we'll have my partner in crime, Dr. Caitlin Rublee, MD, MPH, and she will be discussing heat in prisons and jails. And right after her, we'll have Michael He, who is also an MD candidate. He will be discussing coal power plants and racial disparities. And then we'll have our own Dr. Jed Downs, MD, MPH, and DOMP. He will be discussing wild rice and pipelines. And then we'll round it off with Tia Johnson, who will discuss climate change, race, and food. Each one of these speakers has such a short amount of time to present such extraordinary information. So let's give them your complete attention. Elizabeth Ward, go first. Oh yes, and all speakers have no conflict of interest. Thank you for that slide. Okay, Elizabeth, it's yours.
Great, thank you. So I'm Elizabeth Ward. I am the director for the statewide branch of Sierra Club, and I feel a little bit weird talking about energy burden, especially on Black and Latinx communities in Milwaukee, and I'm a white woman from Madison, so I acknowledge that, Unfortunately, most of our coalition members are busy tonight. It is a busy night. I think everybody getting the last they can out of fall. So I'm going to talk to you about a report we put together with our partners at Alliance for Climate Education, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, Northside Rising, Citizen Action, and Voices de la Frontera. And I am going to go quick because, like she said, a lot of information, a small amount of time. So I put in the chat a link to the report in case you want to dive in for more. This is a photo of some of our coalition members on a recent Facebook Live we did. So they will be here in spirit. If you want to go to the next slide, Abby. Just as some background, in case you're unfamiliar with the term energy burden refers to basically the percentage of your income you pay for energy. So you can calculate it by looking at your energy bills divided by your income, and that's how much you pay out of your income for energy. Across the country, they say a goal, I think 6% is considered extremely high. And somebody who studies this for the whole country came to us and said, you know, Milwaukee, Black households in Milwaukee have on average a 6% energy burden. That is extremely high, that's considered extremely high. So we commissioned the study and put it together. Here's a photo of it. The next slide goes through some of our main takeaways. It looked, so what we did is we took census data and energy burden and looked at it based on neighborhoods, based on their demographics. So all of the information's on neighborhoods. Majority white neighborhoods have an energy burden of 2.1%, which is considered average. The majority Black neighborhoods, this is just within Milwaukee, 5%, and majority Hispanic or Latinx neighborhoods have a 5.3% energy burden. Black neighborhoods can have an energy burden up to 12%, which is just crazy if you think about it. That's how much of your income is going into energy. The next slide, Abby, I think has maps. If you're a map person, that puts this, has a map that shows it energy. The first map on the left is energy burden by percentage. So the red is 8%, blue is 0 to 2%. And the map on the right is by demographic group. So you can see there's heavy correlation and crossover with Black communities and Hispanic and Latinx communities, which are lumped together in the census. The other kind of key takeaways we found, the next slide. If you look at these neighborhoods that are experiencing high energy burden, maybe it's, go back, can you go to the one with redlining, Abby? I may have, there we go. If you look at redlining, which are historically redlined areas are outlined in the red here, you see heavy crossover. And I'll get to this in a minute, but what we found is the historic redlining, the lack of care for the homes in these neighborhoods is what leads to such leaky homes and is a part of why energy burden is so high. Next slide, Abby. So energy burden, the high energy burden is a problem in and of itself, given that means if you're spending so much of your income on energy, you can't have it for your other needs. But it also, we see heavy correlation between asthma rates, given historic pollution and, too far, and eviction rates. So we see a correlation between people struggling to pay their rent and those struggling to pay their energy. If their energy bills were less high, they'd have more income to apply to other things. Asthma rates is both tied to pollution in the area, but as you all know, also when you have high asthma rates, that means high medical bills as well. High missed school, high missed work. And so that is another, it sort of all compounds onto these neighborhoods experiencing this. There's a lot of reasons for the high energy burden: historic racism, historic redlining, housing problems, income and job issues. But one of the ones we found too, is it's not just about income. These houses, the houses and the housing units that these families live in are just not as energy efficient as other homes. So this chart shows the amount, average income and the amount they spend on their income. So if you look in Milwaukee, those with high energy burden have actually higher bills than those in other census tracts, despite the fact that they might actually have bigger homes or not necessarily it doesn't necessarily just correlate to housing size and their income. A lot of this comes from the legacy of racist housing policies. And we found that these homes not only are, like I said, more leaky, but these households have less access to programs like energy efficiency programs. Next slide, Abby. So I wanted to make sure to talk about the three main things we're calling on in order to address this. This is really a big issue, and we are calling on leaders of the state and as well as the local and We Energies, the utility, to address this. So here are a couple of the things we're asking for. I mean, first and foremost, we just need funding for housing upgrades, for weatherization and energy efficiency in the neighborhoods that are suffering from energy burden. So next slide. Our first ask of our coalition is to just call on We Energies to fund a program that targets funding to improve these houses, these households at those neighborhoods suffering from high energy burden. At the same time we made this call, We Energies has proposed, and I won't get into the details here, but a big gas facility. It's a gas storage facility, not in Milwaukee, it's in Ixonia, which is in Jefferson County, but it'd be $460 million to store 10 days worth of gas. So next slide, Abby. What we're asking We Energies to do is cancel plans for this facility and instead put that $460 million, or at least a part of it, into a program aimed at these neighborhoods that would address energy efficiency and weatherization. We commissioned an expert report that found that if We Energies were to do this, they would meet the needs of this facility, which is basically to reduce the amount of gas that they would end up using. Of course, we'd see carbon emissions curved if we're not burning that much gas. Yeah, we'd create jobs and would actually save ratepayers money. So it wouldn't cost, I believe it was something like $160 million less to fund this program rather than build these energy efficiency facilities. And then the third piece, next slide, Abby, we're really excited about. The city of Milwaukee has actually proposed a program that will help this as well. So they've proposed using some of their funding they got from federal COVID money to create a fund, an on-bill financing fund that would allow you to essentially, you could apply whether you're a renter or owner of the house in these neighborhoods. You could get weatherization and energy efficiency upgrades. The savings from getting those upgrades on your bill, so your bill would be immediately reduced. Some of those savings would first be applied and paid down any utility debt you have. We know that's a huge issue coming out of the moratorium ending this past year. So a lot of people are carrying big debt. So all those savings would first be applied to pay down that debt. And then anything left over would be applied to pay down the loan that was used to do the energy efficiency and weatherization upgrades, so that other households can use it. So all three of these things are being decided on soon. The LNG facility and whether or not We Energies should fund energy efficiency instead. We Energies can decide any day to fund their program, and the city of Milwaukee is considering this proposal now. So those are three things that we're hoping move forward to help address this. I hope I didn't go over time. I think that's all I have.
Thank you very, very much. Now I have to review who is next. Next is Jean Bikomeye, Urban Greenspace and Health Equity. Jean, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Dr. Renee. Let me share quickly the link to this published paper as we go through it. I just sent that through the chat. Yeah, as you can see the title, I just want to thank you everybody for giving me this opportunity to talk to you this evening. As you can see on the title, it's a resilience and equity in a time of a crisis. So we are examining the intersecting effect of COVID, and then going back to racism and the climate and the chronic diseases and how those affect health outcome. And then we are proposing a Greenspace as an equity focused intervention to improve health outcome in the communities which are at a higher risk. Can you go to the first slide, please? Yeah, like I said, the outline of this paper, which we just published, is it a month ago. Well, like I said, it's this intersection of these intersecting health crisis: racism, COVID, climate, and the chronic diseases. And we took a brief look at the historical context, and we looked at those intersections, how they affect the health outcome. And then we discussed the role of Greenspace in solving this complex issue. And we kind of provided how by reviewing the literature. And then we presented a way forward where we looked at the current political will and what could be done to harness this moment of political to take an opportunity to create life-lasting changes. And then we also gave some key consideration and examples by discussing the case of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then we also presented the conceptual framework and they gave some concluding remarks for our readers. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so we want to give a visual presentation of the work. And this is actually a visual abstract where you could see the first side, the right-hand side of the abstract. We are reviewing the issues for COVID and racism and also air pollution, which is kind of representing a climate, and also chronic diseases, where we have a patient on bed and the heart monitor in there. And then from there, we're moving to the next transition of urban green spaces as a potential intervention to improve outcome, where we can see kids on the far right side of the slide, playing soccer in a green environment. So can you go to the next one, please? Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna talk much about this, but the first thing we did was to really look at how structural racism impact health outcome. And like the first presenter, we looked at the historical context, and one of those big things was redlining, on how neighborhoods were made poor and objectively declining because of those policies that were made in history. And all of these historical contexts have created an environment which puts some neighborhood at increased risk of exposure to all kind of pathogenic things, including air pollution. And when the COVID came, we saw how it was impacting individuals of color who are living in this neighborhood. And racism has just a big part to play in all of this outcome that we see. Can we go to the next one, please? And then, yeah, we looked at the racism and the COVID, on how there is a link between racism and the COVID, and looked at the current disparities in outcome by reviewing the papers. And then looked at the climate change and the health inequity, how the climate change affect individuals, not just country to country, but also within the countries. We know that countries that contribute to climate change are not necessarily the ones that carry the heaviest burden of the negative impact of climate change. But within countries, inequalities to individuals in the poor communities, such as those that are historically redlined, they have a burden of extra heat that comes from the global warming. They have a burden of all of those negative health outcomes. They just have a much higher burden from this negative effect of climate change. And all of this adds up to the growing and actually existing burden of chronic diseases, which also impact these poorer communities. Now adding the need of access to chronic medication and the need to cope with all of this threat, it just adds up. And these individuals are just at a much higher risk and the negative outcome. Can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, so we had previous published a paper which was looking at the positive externalities or like positive benefits of climate change mitigation and adaptation on human health. And the far right-hand side, which is a climate change interventions, we're discussing potential intervention and describing some pathways. Like all of those interventions are done through specific pathways. We get some positive outcome on climate change, but this do not happen alone. We also get other health outcome through other different pathways. And really, any climate change intervention has a positive health outcome. And sometimes policymakers tend to look at the cost that caused the interventions, and they do not continue to actually assess the health impact, which puts down the cost. If the benefits are higher beyond climate change, we should look at all of those benefits in our policy discussion. Next one, please. Next slide, please. And then we put this conceptual framework in this paper, which we just published a few weeks ago. And this one is narrowing down to urban green space as an intervention to address all of these issues: COVID, racism, chronic diseases, and also climate change. And we imagine a healthier nation with no disparities and health equity. Can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, so with all of this, we looked at the current political will and discussed how could we harness this moment of opportunity and talk to all of these who are involved in this discussion to make lasting changes by investing in these urban green spaces, to improve health equity by reducing the burden of all of these crises in this neighborhood so that we can improve health equity. Next one, please. Then we gave some key strategic consideration for these stakeholders, including consideration of the type of green space and how they affect outcome, then focus on equity, and also beware of green gentrification to make sure that anything that gets done in these neighborhoods, we do it in a strategic way to make sure that there is no gentrification. So these benefits needed to benefit everybody and not push people out. And then you consider all type of green space and how they enable individual to use them and also activate existing type of spaces to make sure there is a maximum health benefit, and also leverage the need of targeting school context for environmental education to make sure that we instill in young children this culture of loving the environment so that they can grow into future environmental ambassadors. And we have all of this listed in the paper, which is available online and published. And consider the role of communities in all of this partnership to involve local communities to ensure how they get funded and how they enable opportunities within the communities, including people to take care of and maintain these spaces, and also consider the promise of urban wood in all of this context, and then engage everybody in the local community. Yeah, so this is how the paper was framed, and I think I may have went over time, but I'm happy to continue discussing this work. And Dr. Rublee was actually one of the co-authors on this paper, and she gave some really valuable insight. Yeah, and our conclusion, it's very simple. We just called on stakeholders to really consider this green space as an important strategy in solving this complex crisis, so that we can actually move to a healthier nation with less disparities and more equitable resources. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. And now we're looking forward to hearing from Caitlin Rublee, who is going to talk about heat in prisons and jails. Caitlin?
Yep. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. So really, I have a few aims. We're going to briefly talk about climate change and heat-related illnesses, the state of incarceration in the United States, and current prison and jail state nationally. And then we're going to really talk about next steps of what we can do moving forward. Next slide, please. So this topic really came to me several years ago when I was caring for these critically ill patients. As an emergency medicine physician, I see many people who are experiencing incarceration in the ER, and I found them to be some of the sickest patients I cared for. They came in with really severe lung infections, as well as heart conditions, blood infections, and so on. And I started asking them about the places where they came from and what it was like. And I listened to their stories about how they didn't have air conditioning or didn't always have access to water and were in these really thick clothes. And so that's what I'm going to talk more about today. Next slide, please. So it should be no surprise to you that climate change is here. July was the hottest month on record, and right here in Wisconsin, the projections are for warmer temperatures, and what matters most, heat index. It's going to touch every part of our state. Next slide, please. This heat matters because it matters to the people living in this state and on this planet. So heat-related illnesses are severe. Heat stroke is the most life-threatening heat-related illness, and every year in the United States, it kills more than 700 people that we know of, and this is likely a vast underestimate. And so it's something we need to care about and talk about. Next slide. People who are experiencing incarceration are also affected by heat stroke, and there are people who die within these structures due to heat. Next slide, please. Now, it may be surprising to you that the United States has more than 2 million people who are experiencing incarceration. This is a prison population rate of 655 per 100,000. This is #1 in the world. No other country touches this. You can see El Salvador, Thailand, Cuba, the Maldives have high rates, but nothing close to the United States. And so this is a lot of people who will increasingly be impacted. Next slide. Now, right here in Wisconsin, we have a prison population of about 20,000. And you can see it's grown over time, partly due to population growth, but it's been pretty steady the last few years. Next slide. And there's significant racial disparities. If we look at a national average of all of the different states, the rate of incarceration for Blacks is 5 times that of whites. If we look at Wisconsin, the rate is more than double that at 11.5 times. Now, it's not only the people who are experiencing incarceration, but it's also their families. For example, 1 in 50 children have a parent in prison. It's also much of the staff that is required to run these facilities. And so correctional officers, for example, or food service personnel who are in charge of cooking for these 2 million people, as well as the medical personnel like ourselves who are in charge of caring for this population. Next slide, please. There are many contributors to poor health within these settings. One is aging infrastructure. Many of these buildings are old, they're not energy efficient, they lack air conditioning or proper ventilation, such as windows. They might have one ice machine that serves hundreds of people, and if that breaks or goes out, that means no ice. They're often overcrowded. And then there are multiple compound climate hazards. Thinking about the Gulf or coastal areas, sometimes even if a facility does have air conditioning, a storm comes in, knocks out power, and leaves these individuals for days without any sort of climate controlled setting. There's also wastewater, and so it'll break, such as the winter storm. Many of the water infrastructure was damaged, and it was left with sewage everywhere where these people had to live. The underlying population is also puts them at risk for heat-related illness. And so they have underlying medical conditions. Overall, there's an aging population, and then they might not have access to healthcare like others do. Next slide. Compared with the US population, people in prison facilities were 3.4 times more likely to report having a heart-related problems and 1.5 times more likely to have diabetes or asthma. And then it also contributes to violence and injuries. So days with unsafe heat index levels raised the probability of any violence by 18%. And this was a study done in Mississippi. And so thinking about all the traumatic injuries I see, and that anger and agitation that is just fueled by these warm environments in a population that already has a lot of external stressors is really important. Next slide, please. Again, medications are a big risk factor and actually make these individuals more at risk for heat-related illness and health harms related to these exposures. Psychiatric medications, antihypertensive, and again, having other medical conditions that put them at risk. These are a list of about 13 states. There are only some of them, but they have no policies in place that require air conditioning. And so many prisons and jails in these states don't have mandatory cooling, and again, put their populations at risk who are within their structures. Next slide, please. If you look at the Wisconsin Department of Corrections map, you can see there's facilities across our state, and there's actually a master facilities plan. And so I took a few excerpts from the November plan, and I wanted to share that with you. Next slide. It just talks to the aging infrastructure. So here were a few quotes. Air conditioning units are beginning to be problematic and are at the end of their useful life at 25 years. Air handling units conditions most areas, but air conditioning is only provided in control and administration areas. Some air conditioning exists, but it's primarily limited to staff occupancies. Food service staff offices have no air conditioning, and there is no air conditioning or humidity control, resulting in a hot, humid work environment. Next slide. So what are next steps? How do we address this? And there are multiple solutions, but here are a few. Number one is reduce the number of incarcerated people. Again, talking about criminal justice reform and some of the processes that go in place. Number two is reducing high-risk person susceptibility to heat. And so a few examples in facilities that don't have air conditioning would be having a geriatric housing unit that is air conditioning, conditioned, for example, for the highest risk people who are exposed. Number three is looking at building climate resilient facilities and retrofitting existing facilities so that they are more energy efficient and ventilated. And then lastly, policies. And policies that require adequate cooling, but other climate measures as well, based on local vulnerability and climate hazards. Next slide. Many good things are already in the works. And so people are using Greenspace, as we just heard about, in jails and prisons as a way to promote wellness and as a way to teach these individuals skills and give them passion for growing their own meals, for example. They're talking about the meals that they do serve and encouraging plant-based diets. There's also organizations like Planting Justice, who is, again, giving these people who are experiencing incarceration life skills and connection, and so that they can reduce recidivism rates. And then lastly is really thinking about climate justice and racial justice as opportunities as we move forward and seeing this as an opportunity for action. Next slide. Now, this is really just the beginning of the discussion, because when it comes to prisons and jails, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to protect people. And so, for example, these climate fueled mega fires in California The firefighters are people who are experiencing incarceration some of the time. And so there's specific legislation on that and different rules and policies. But in the setting of these growing fires, what does that mean from an environmental justice perspective? All of these facilities are also part of the problem, and they contribute to climate change through all of their costly operations and fueling rising levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, thinking about climate change and climate actions and these facilities as a way to reduce emissions. And then thirdly, thinking about the compound hazards. For example, in Pennsylvania, this prison was built right next to a power plant, which we will hear about coming up. And the assaults of heat combined with air pollution are just devastating for many of these individuals. Next slide, please. So thank you so much. And we'll move on to the next topic. And I look forward to answering any of your questions at the end.
Dr. Rublee, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Michael He, and he's going to talk about coal power plants and racial disparities. So far, we're doing pretty good, staying on track. Go ahead, Dr. He.
Student Dr. He, but thank you.
Okay.
That's all right. Yeah, honored to be here with this wonderful panel of speakers, and thank you for that great segue, Caitlin. So yeah, I'm going to be discussing the health impacts of coal power in Wisconsin. My presentation is going to be largely based on a summer research project that I was working on, kind of looking at the respiratory function and racial health disparities in correlation with proximity to coal power plants in Wisconsin. Next slide, please. So some of the health impacts of air pollution include impaired brain development in children, respiratory and cardiovascular disease that disproportionately impacts specific populations, leading to about 7 million premature deaths each year globally, per some estimates. The effects of climate change are compounded with worse air quality from pollution, heat, and wildfires, amongst other things. This is sort of one of the defining features of climate change, and it really impacts us all in a variety of ways, depending on where we live. So personally, my home province of British Columbia now prepares for and faces an annual forest fire season that frequently destroys entire towns while making it dangerous for people of all ages to set foot outside. This image was actually taken just above my hometown 2 years ago, actually. So the province, took a little news excerpt out there. The province issued a warning a couple summers ago stating that every hour spent outside was the equivalent of smoking an entire pack of cigarettes in some parts of the province itself. Next slide, please. So for Wisconsin, it currently has 3 coal-fired power plants that don't have any plans to close. Policymakers here have an opportunity to greatly improve public health with a shift in the energy technologies that we choose, particularly for the most vulnerable populations. Nationally, there are estimates that early retirement of these coal power plants could save tens of thousands of lives over the next 15 years from reduced particulate matter in the air. There are multiple projects currently being disputed surrounding natural gas power plants, as I believed Elizabeth mentioned earlier, but we're just going to focus on coal power in this presentation. Next slide, please. So the burning of fossil fuels is a primary source of greenhouse gas emissions, not only in Wisconsin, but around the world. These coal power plants are the leading source of carbon dioxide from electricity generation, making up about 60% of the CO2 emissions in the US, while only providing about a quarter of the national electricity generation. This picture here is just kind of presenting the median emission values of various electricity production methods, according to the IPCC. Next slide, please. So on this slide, the data here was produced from the World Health Organization, and it's kind of demonstrating the deaths that were due to air pollution. Residential proximity to coal-fired power plants has been associated with a lot of the same health impacts as seen in this study from ambient air pollution. And there have been other studies demonstrating that closure of these coal power plants in certain US states has demonstrated significant local air quality improvement. So the goal of this study was to quantify the relationship between race, residential distance from these power plants, and the respiratory function of Wisconsin residents. Next slide, please. So how we went about it is we examined previously collected respiratory and demographic information to evaluate the respiratory function in relation to the distance to these power plants. We also evaluated a variety of socioeconomic parameters to assess protective and risk factors that may be contributing to this pulmonary pathology. Spirometry measurements give us values of forced expiratory volume in 1 second and forced vital capacity listed as an FEV1 to FVC ratio. Readings below 80% were considered abnormal and suggestive of an obstructive pulmonary disorder. We grouped our participants based on residential distance to these power plants. So either living within 35 kilometers of them or living further than that. Next slide, please. So during the time the data was collected, there were 11 power plants in Wisconsin that were operational, and our sample population included over 2,200 adults. The odds ratio of low FEV1 to FVC ratios was 1.24 for those living within 35 kilometers compared to those residing further away. And all that means is it suggests there may be a higher likelihood of obstructive pulmonary disease in those living within that 35-kilometer radius. We assessed many factors as risk factors or protective, but one of the most powerful comparisons we found was that living within that 35-kilometer radius may be posing a risk of obstructive lung disease similar to smoking for 5 to 10 years. Although we can't claim it was statistically significant, as you can see the confidence interval crosses 1, it may still be suggestive of higher odds of obstructive pulmonary disease. One of the other potential fallbacks of this study was the difficulties with accounting for wind speed and direction, as that might impact the location and distances of the particulate matter in the air, but it's just very difficult to quantify. Next slide, please. Another important finding that we had that's probably more closely related to this speaking series is that we found that Black individuals made up 13.3% of, well, I think someone's speaker's on. Black individuals made up 13.3% of the population living within that 35-kilometer radius, despite only accounting for 4.8% of our total sample population. Similarly, you can see that Hispanic populations accounted for 4.8% of those living in that radius, while only making up 2.8% of our total population. This larger proportion of people of color living within that radius predisposes them to the higher risk of negative health effects of air pollution, as I discussed earlier. Next slide, please. So with these damaging effects in mind, it's important to look at what we can change moving forward. Well, it's the larger economies that tend to be producing greater emissions. It's the poor communities and the poor nations that feel the impact first and most significantly. Building new renewable energy sources are now cheaper than running current coal-fired power plants, which greatly limits their economic viability. One of the strengths of this study in particular was being able to provide local policymakers with direct data from within the state, offering an opportunity to improve the health of the residents locally and globally as well. Next slide, please. So these fossil fuel subsidies should ideally be halted in favor of cleaner energy technologies that have dropped in cost substantially. With the rapidly spreading wildfires, drought, and severe weather events, the climate crisis should be treated as a global public health emergency as well. Air pollution and their local health impact should also be taken into consideration with urban planning and new community projects moving forward, as this would kind of help to address a lot of the racial and ethnic health disparities we see across the nation. Next slide, please. And I'd just like to thank all the individuals listed here for all their invaluable support and expertise. And in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Caitlin Rublee for her mentorship and relentless support over the past couple of years in helping with this project as well. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Next, we have Dr. Jed Downs, who will discuss the very important subject, wild rice and pipelines. Dr. Downs.
Yes, I'm an old white guy tasked with talking about environmental justice and Native Americans. And I'm discussing the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline as an environmental justice issue. Line 3 is a pipeline, you can see the map, which crosses about 340 miles of northern Minnesota and ends up at a refinery in Wisconsin, in Superior, Wisconsin. There's a pipeline that has been in existence since and operational since 1968, which has been responsible for spills of 1.7 and 1.3 million gallons of crude. And it's corroded and breaking down. And so a new and it was felt to be too expensive to repair the old pipeline. So a new pipeline was proposed and is at this point in time probably 90% done. The new route avoids crossing the Leech Lake Reservation and the Fond du Lac Ojibwe reservations. At this point in time, the protests have largely been driven by residents of the White Earth and Red Lake bands. Enbridge was able to divide tribal cohesion via hiring 95 workers from Fond du Lac and Leech Lake out of about 2,400 involved in the pipeline project, and by making cash payments to the bands. Many tribal members are reliant on cash payments largely generated from casino revenues, which dried up completely in the time of COVID. By accepting the cash money from Enbridge, the Fond du Lac band was able to keep up its $400 per capita monthly payments. The other leverage that was used, that Enbridge agreed to remove the old pipeline from the reservations. Elsewhere in the state, the pipelines will simply be abandoned and left to decay in place. And once they really begin leaking, that'll disturb and potentially pollute wetlands and water distribution. Enbridge argued that removing the old line would disturb wetlands, yet they had permission to divert 5 billion gallons of water during the laying of the new pipeline. The United States and Minnesota do not have regulations with regards to removal of old pipeline. However, Canada, and Enbridge is a Canadian corporation, regulates that stuff significantly. I forgot to mention that the route crosses 200 bodies of water, including the Mississippi, St. Louis, and Nemadji rivers, 2 of which flow into Lake Superior, as well as disturbing 3,400 acres of wild rice-bearing waters. The next slide, please. The Line 3 protests have involved encampments, spirit lodges, and along the course of the pipeline. There's been a large presence of women and Two-Spirit people, which would be LGBTQ, but Native Americans have recognized these as just a different class of normal people throughout time. The Enbridge paid for an escrow account to fund local police to be able to arrest and control the protests. And to date, those funds have supplemented about $500,000 of local law enforcement coffers. Next slide. Wild rice. I don't know how many of you have actually harvested wild rice, but it's an aquatic grass with harvestable seeds. It needs water levels of 3 to 36 inches in order to thrive. It is susceptible to significant water level changes during its growth cycle, and adequate water depths are necessary at the time of harvest for traditional methods in the canoe. If you have market elevations of water during the floating stage, the rice will be pulled out of the soil by its roots. If you have inadequate water at time of harvest, it can't be harvested. In good stands, people could harvest enough rice in a day to sustain a family through the winter season. However, there'd be parching and winnowing, which would add many additional hours of labor to the rice before it was really ready for storage. Wild rice holds significant spiritual importance to the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. The health of wild rice was viewed as being the source of health for the people. Next slide, please. All right, let's turn to social injustices that Indigenous people in North America have been subjected to over time. They were displaced from lands during colonialization and westward expansion. They were subjected to genocidal intent and actions such as smallpox blankets and destruction of food sources, almost causing the bison to go extinct. They were enslaved beginning in, I think the first record was in 1636 and continued at a fairly decent rate till the 1730s and to some extent beyond. They were more commonly enslaved in the Northeast than were Africans in the early colonial period. They were sold and shipped to the Sugar Islands, where they could not make use of their deep knowledge of their local landscape to survive in order to be able to escape. And records show that maybe as many as 51,000 Native Americans or indigenous people were sold to the Caribbean out of Charleston in the Carolina colony. There have been repeated violations of treaties. In this case, the treaties with the Ojibwe that seized the northern third of Minnesota, which would be the 1854, 1855, and 1862 treaties. The 1862 allowed my great-grandfather to be able to homestead in Becker County in Minnesota, which would be part of the White Earth Territory. The treaties guaranteed what are called usufructuary rights, the rights to harvest and profit from the lands that were ceded. But if the ecosystems are destroyed, what value are those rights? Seized lands in these treaties were then available for purchase and plunder by lumber and steel barons such as Andrew Carnegie and Frederick Weyerhaeuser. Once forced onto reservations, Indian boarding schools were established, which separated Indian children from their extended families, community, culture, and spirituality in the name of conversion to Catholicism or other Christian denominations. The goal was to take the Indian out of the Indian. Children were exposed to severe corporal punishment for speaking their native tongues and for other infractions. And after a tour of, graduating from a boarding school, children were often outed, sent to live with white families to provide labor and housekeeping duties instead of being sent back to their families. Next slide, please. Here we have a photo of the finished product of the Alberta Tar Sands. It is bitumen or tar. It's basically as thick as cold molasses. It's 22% more carbon intense than regular crude oil because the oil sands have to be steam heated with steam generated by burning natural gas or sometimes even the tar sands themselves in order to generate the heat to separate the hydrocarbons from the clay and sand that are in the area. It has to be diluted with low molecular weight carbon solvents to get it to basically be able to be suspended and to be able to flow through the pipeline. It's high in sulfur and heavy metals. Wild rice is particularly sensitive to sulfide levels, and spills of this of the tar sands would be capable of basically killing off large swaths of wild rice because of the sulfur content. Tar sands exist naturally under muskeg, and they are heavier than water. So if there is a spill, they're extremely hard to clean up. You can't use booms to sweep up the oil and that sort of thing because it's basically going to sink. And all right, the total volume of tar sands is estimated to be, or not of the tar sands, the amount of volume of the pipeline is 760,000 barrels per day. And over the course of a 365-day year, that is when that's burned, that'll be the equivalent of the annual CO2 production of coal-fired power plants. Last slide, please. John Hollowhorn Bear was an Oglala Lakota chief and spokesperson early in the 20th century. He rode in inaugural parades for Teddy Roosevelt and another president. And this is a comment he made in his negotiations with the US government. Someday, the earth will weep. She will beg for her life. She will cry with tears of blood. You will make a choice if you help her or let her die. And when she dies, you will too. It may be the earth is sweating blood rather than weeping blood at this point, but we are at a crossroads, not only for ourselves, but for our indigenous peoples and the deep ecological knowledge that they carry. Thank you for considering this. Thank you for allowing me to make these comments.
Dr. Downs, that was excellent. Our final presenter tonight is Tia Johnson. She's going to discuss climate change, race, and food.
Hello. Years ago, I was backpacking through South America, traveling on a shoestring, riding buses country to country. One day the bus stopped and in the middle of rural Bolivia. A large multi-generational family emerged from the tall grasses lining the roadway. Passengers grabbed for their bags, I assumed to toss a few coins to the impoverished family. As I took out my wallet, the passenger next to me shook his head and asked simply, "What can they do with money out here?" Then I noticed the passengers were not throwing money. They were tossing bags of food and bread. Next slide. Wisconsin has abundant beauty and resources. However, our Badger State has got some work to do. Year after year, we have been the worst state for Black people to live in. In 2016, Laura Dresser, the Associate Director of the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, said, 4 in 10 Black kids in this state are living in poverty, living in situations where getting to the end of the month, getting food on the table, healthcare, and utilities are very hard questions. Almost half of all Black children in Wisconsin live in poverty, nearly 4 times the rate of white children. Just 1% of Wisconsin's white children live in high poverty areas, compared to 35% of Wisconsin's Black children. Next slide. We know we have got this problem. What are we going to do to change it? First, we need to know where to focus our efforts. There are only 5 counties in Wisconsin that, as of 2018, had a Black population greater than 5%. These are Rock, Dane, Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee counties. If we have the political will and the desire to rid ourselves of this label as the worst state for Black people to live in, we should first address the issues involving race in these 5 counties. Next slide. The United Nations Committee on World Food Security defines food security as all people at all times having physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their preferences and dietary needs for active and healthy life. The USDA describes food security as a range of severity from high food security to very low food security, in which eating patterns of one or more household members are disrupted and food intake reduced because that household lacked money or other resources for that food. Next slide, please. Food sovereignty is a food system in which the people who produce, distribute, and consume food also control the mechanism and policies of food production and distribution. This is different from corporate food system in which corporations and market institutions control the global food system. Food sovereignty focuses on food for people, where people have the right to sufficient, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. Food providers are valued, food systems are localized, and control is local. Food sovereignty focuses on production and harvesting methods that maximize the contribution of ecosystems that avoid costly and toxic inputs and that improve the resiliency of local food systems in the face of climate change. Next slide. From 2013 to 2015, more than 11% of all Wisconsin's households were food insecure. Food insecure households may run out of food, cut back on the size of meals, or skip meals due to the lack of money for food. This food insecurity increases the risk of health problems and is linked with worse educational outcomes. For the most vulnerable groups, the risk of food insecurity exceeds 1 in 3. These groups are households with any disabled members, financially poor households, racial and ethnic minorities, households with non-citizens, and households with low education. Next slide, please. Although Wisconsin's households overall have a lower risk of food insecurity than the national rate, the Wisconsin Black and Hispanic households fared worse than those same groups nationally. The disparity in food insecurity between Black and white households in Wisconsin is among the largest in the nation. Next slide, please. In 2020, in Wisconsin, Black households had both housing and food insecurity 4 times higher than white households. The pandemic has affected food insecurity in the U.S. During the early months of the pandemic, food insecurity was higher than at any time in the 25 years since researchers have been tracking it systematically. Statewide, there is only one county that had a rate greater than 15%, Menominee County, but it had an overall low total number of people experiencing food insecurity with only 800. What societal issues could be healed if the state invested the additional money required to reduce or eliminate food insecurity for these counties? Next slide, please. 2020 will be remembered for COVID-19. 2021 will be remembered for severe climatic events. The widespread freezing in Texas, flash flooding in several New England states and Germany and Belgium, wildfires in the West, in Greece and Canada, intense hurricanes. As we speak now, Texas is preparing for up to 2 feet of rain as Tropical Storm Nicholas approaches. The heat waves of this summer forced farmers to leave fields fallow and crops unharvested because the fruits, such as these cherries in Oregon, were destroyed by the extreme heat. Next slide, please. In 2021, in the 2011 heat wave, roughly 4,000 cattle were killed in Iowa, where heat indexes were 110 degrees Fahrenheit for several days. This heat also affects the fertility of the bulls and the ability of the heifers to stay pregnant. In 2019, in Australia, hundreds of thousands of cattle were killed in record-breaking rainfall, causing flooding after years of drought, destroying many farming communities. In 2021, according to the Atlantic article, "What is this doing to their lungs?" the wildfire smoke is diminishing milk production in cows. The elevated levels of fine particulate matter has been correlated with increased disease such as udder infections. Next slide, please. In 2014, the University of Wisconsin had a study which found climate change is likely to affect milk production because of the sensitivity of dairy cows to extreme temperature and humidity. The researchers project that climate change will result in losses of $670 million annually. Next slide. Wisconsin farms and agricultural businesses generate about $6 billion in economic activity and employ about 354,000 people. The agricultural production will be impacted by longer frost-free periods, lower daily maximum temperatures in summer, and more summer precipitation. As a result, plant stresses may actually decrease, leading to higher yields. The carbon dioxide causing climate change may boost photosynthesis. However, more spring precipitation may lead to compacted, waterlogged soils and delays in planting. This increased precipitation may fall during more intense rain events, raising the cost of field maintenance and accelerating loss of soil productivity. Next slide. Wisconsin's growing season is expected to increase by 1 month by 2090. As the growing season increases, the higher humidity and warmer temperatures promote pests and disease, which could lower yields and increase management costs. The increases in temperature, moisture, and carbon dioxide will also result in more weed growth. Farmers may end up using more pesticides, which may impact native pollinators such as bees, upon which crops depend. Global warming has become the largest single threat to health, community well-being, and the environment. The disastrous effects of climate change fall hardest on low-income communities and people of color. Climate victims are linked by the high levels of vulnerability, the result of historic and recent exploitations and oppression. Our modern food system is at the center of both causes and effects of climate change. Pathways to community resilience and the reversal of global warming pass through multiple challenges of capitalism, racism, and food. Next slide. Wisconsin farmers will need to adapt to climate change by being able to cope with uncertain conditions. Community-supported agriculture, CSAs, is a strategy that has helped small family farms adapt to fluctuations in growing season. Wisconsin has one of the highest numbers of CSA farms nationally. People of color are on the front lines of climate crisis. Power imbalances have hindered communities of color to counter the impact of climate change and to have a say and gain in climate solutions. Building political and economic power and speaking up about the challenges are essential components of climate resilience. To ensure that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income, are guaranteed protection from the worst effects of climate change, they must be involved in the conversations of planning and implementing the solutions of climate change. Thank you.
Well, at this point, I want to say thank you, Tia, for such an excellent presentation, and thank you to all of our presenters. And thank every one of you who chose to take time tonight to join us and to enjoy the extraordinary presentations by all of our remarkable speakers tonight. So now you have a very good idea of what fuels our passion and why anti-racism plays such a huge role in climate action. So at this point in time, I would like to open the floor to questions for each one of our speakers, but also to invite you individually to consider supporting our efforts and possibly even joining us. So here are some polls, and I would like for you to take a moment to answer the questions on the polls, but also if you would like to put your questions in the chat, I'll make sure we bring those questions up. But I would really like to open the floor for any verbal questions as well.